in Education, Hofstra University, and Ted Kesler, Associate Professor in Literacy at Queens College of the City University of New York. Welcome you both.
Thank you.
Um, Talk about your roles on the executive committee and how it has helped you with advocacy both within NCTE and perhaps outside of NCTE.
Uh, I guess I'll go first.
Okay.
I'm in the chairperson of the elementary section, um, and it's been a pleasure serving in that position. I guess my uh, within NCTE, I do approach this. It's a volunteer position, but I do approach it as I'm here to serve the elementary section members. So I don't see like we're giving you, we're imposing a program on you, but it's more I'm trying to be as responsive as possible to who our members are and what they need and what they want. So I think that drives that intention uh, for capacity building or for advocacy. Uh, the other point I'll make and then give it over to Debra is I think that those days in Washington D.C. Have influenced me as far as what our position statements or policy statements might be and what they can do, and just being there in that context for making changes for what happens in education.
And I think that I also see myself as Whole Language Umbrella president, representing the Whole Language Umbrella group, and also our concerns with teachers and the conditions in which teachers are teaching and students are learning. And in many ways, the rights of teachers to teach and the rights of students to learn. And so the professional role of teachers is always at the forefront. And when I go to talk with people in Washington, D.C., I'm always concerned about, what's going on in the classroom and helping legislators and their aides and so forth to see that. It's really been wonderful for me to be on the board, on the executive committee of NCTE, and to get to connect with other conferences and sections and to learn, where our interests overlap and the different perspectives within NCTE. And I think that's really strengthened all of us to be able to work together. So I appreciated that role.
Debra, talk about the Reading Detective Club.
Okay. I have you know what? I have to tell a story that just happened today because I wrote the Reading Detective Club in 1999, and it's really a book about the reading process for children, and so it's a unit of study. There's individual detective cases, and it's based on a strategy rather than skill perspective that says that what we are teaching kids is the strategies for making meaning and for being effective meaning makers and thinking about text. And so all the different aspects of the reading process, starting with, we use in reading, we use the semantic cueing system. So with kids, we talk about meaning clues, language clues, and basically phonics clues that we use when we're reading, and then the strategies that we use. And they're developed through cases that are a little bit like Meet the Great style cases, where you meet these three kids, and the kids read a case where they have to find a missing word or something like that, and then they talk about it in small groups or one-on-one with the teacher, depending on how literacy specialists use it. And it's really an entire lesson in reading. It addresses schema, it addresses actually embedded spelling, lots of different aspects of reading. It puts kids in the role of seeing that they are already effective readers and recognizing the strategies that they use that are effective. I had the most amazing experience on the elevator today. That book was written in 1999. A teacher saw my badge and she said, "Did you write a book called Reading Detective Club?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "I want to give you a high five." Right? And then she said, "I use that book every single semester with my kids in my classroom." And she said, "I want to tell you that when that book first came out, I used it with my nephew. And he was a third grader who was a struggling reader. And you saved his life." I'm like, wow.
Wow.
I've
Wow.
never had that kind of experience before.
This morning.
So it's interesting. It's a book that I worked a lot on, and has a kind of it's a version of retrospective miscue analysis actually, and it has a kind of profound effect on kids because it helps them to really think strategically about reading.
That's wonderful. Well, Ted, you were
Yes.
a featured teacher in a year-long series of articles with Jack Steinberg of the New York
Yes.
Times, Class 3223, Mr. Kesler Struggles and Talk. Could you talk about that series?
Yes, that was, I guess, talking about advocacy. I was really, for that year, the most public school teacher in the country, probably maybe the world. And it was a real learning curve for me because the first article, I saw how the way he wrote things, sometimes it was decontextualized and misconstrued. And so I learned to become much more articulate with him, reframing what I was doing in like 3 or 4 ways so that he understood the practices I was doing. But consequently, I became very articulate about my practices, not just with him, but with everyone. So to the point where I started acting like if the loudspeaker was on in the school, in my classroom, and I was being broadcast in the office, nothing that's happening in the room, I could justify or explain everything that was happening during the day, like transparent. So
not changing your practice, but
it,
the rationale behind it.
right,
Yeah.
Right, be metacognitive
Right.
about my practices.
Right.
So that it made me, and I actually think that way, that not close your classroom door, but it should be open to the world to see.
Mm-hmm. That's very good.
That's an important part of advocacy.
Yes.
Ted, tell me about your paper, Writing for Social Action in Our Digital Age.
So that was a chapter,
Okay.
and that basically I embrace the 21st century literacy practices. So I'm definitely not someone who says leave your devices behind when you come to the school door. But I do think that teachers have to be savvy about how students use those devices for the purposes of academic learning. So with my students, both graduate students and in schools, we come up with what are meaningful digital tools for communicating for the purposes or messages that we want. In that context, in that chapter, I was talking about social action writing, where, I guess again, it's for advocacy. And that chapter was focusing on graduate students where they had to really come up with community-based issues and topics. But then I was privileging or valuing digital responses and creative digital responses. So we did have like students who made comic books, and others who have made posters that would appear at bus stations or bus stops, and others who have made movies, digital movies. And I guess the proof that it impacted them is that they would post them in public social media formats long after they worked with me.
That's wonderful. Debra, talk about your years teaching in the Detroit public schools.
Oh, okay. So I was a teacher for 15 years in Detroit Public Schools, and I I attended Detroit Public Schools from second grade to 12th grade, and I actually worked as a student teacher in some suburban school districts, and I really wanted to work in Detroit. I worked in 3 different schools that were all in poverty communities, and 2 of them were magnet schools where kids were integrated into the school. One had an international theme and one had a whole language theme. And I always thought that the problems, when I would come to conferences, teachers would ask me, they would see my badge, which now says New York, but at that time said Detroit, and they'd say, "Oh, you're from Detroit. That's too bad. I'm sorry." And I'm like, "No." And I always thought the problems, the difficulties of working in Detroit were not what people thought. They thought that we were being attacked by our kids every day or something like that. Right. You must get that in New York. And, I love the kids. The kids were wonderful. But I did have always, Ted and I were talking about this, that we both had more than 30 kids in our classrooms working in urban districts. And so I always had 33 to 34 students, so that was always a challenge. The bathrooms were not always clean. The doors are locked, to come into the buildings, even before all the added security that we've had recently. And you had an environment that wasn't always friendly to children, not necessarily within the classrooms, but sometimes in the auditorium and so forth. Kids have to be walked in line for class to class. And it was very different than the kind of camaraderie and respect that I saw in my son's suburban district, just sort of the general overall atmosphere. But I think that teachers in Detroit were doing really brilliant work with kids. I loved working in multicultural communities. Detroit at that time was 85% African American city, so most of the schools that I worked in, most of my classrooms were majority African American, and working with populations on thematic studies that looked at the history of civil rights in America, the history of cultures and contact in America, childhood in America, and going kind of cross chronologies and looking at different cultural groups. I did a lot of community study with kids. I really believed in that because I wanted to get before we got into inquiry, I wanted to get them to see the authors of books as somebody like your Uncle Joe, who is a person who has an opinion that, is not infallible, you know what I'm saying? And I didn't want them to just see research as you go to a book and you copy something down and that's how you do research. So we did, for the community, for the cultures and context in America, we did family histories. That was how we started it. And then from those family histories, we learned about Michigan being the German farm workers, the French Canadians that came down from Canada and took care of the lumber, got rid of it so that the German farm workers moved in. The blacks from the South who came up during World War II and worked in the factories, the women factory workers during World War II, the different immigration histories and why people immigrated, so the Eastern European Jews, all of these different histories came out in our family history, and then the kids could pick their inquiry topics that they could then explore some of these areas and then share those back with the class. In Childhood in America, I had all the kids. Initially, it's funny because I've been thinking about this a lot now that this year I turned 60, that initially I thought the kids should interview an adult who was over 60, about their childhood. What was it like when you were 10 years old? Because I taught 5th graders. And so instead of that, I had them interview well, it occurred to me that the Vietnam War, because I was teaching in the 80s, was ancient history to those kids too. They hadn't experienced 1969, the moon landing, all of these events that were a big part. We were just talking about JFK, which happened when I was 8 years old. So all of these events that were a big part of my life were ancient history to them. They were only 10 years old, so I had them interview any adult of any age, just an adult. So we got this range from 20 to 70 of different experiences that adults had had. And then that piece, by the way, I had them with the family histories. One of the things I didn't want them to also see research as you do research and you write a report. So they did oral presentations, they did big displays, and for the cultures and for the childhood in America where we did the interviews of adult, they turned their interview into a sketch of a character sketch of a person. And we went through that process very slowly of how you do that, mapping it out and pulling it together. I told the parents, I don't want you to help them with that report. We're going to work on it in class. And so, that was kind of the way that I built on community study. I actually worked with Patty Stock and David Chasma and other people at University of Michigan during the time that I was in Detroit Public Schools. So David Bloom did a research study in my school. So, there was a lot of contact with me, by the way, all the time that I was in Detroit. I should mention this. I came to NCTE every single year. And for me, it was like I would come to NCTE and I would be like this. And I would leave and I would be like this, And by the way, I was never supported to come to NCTE. And some years, I didn't even apply for absence with pay because then if I was denied it, in other words, I just called in sick. I kind of gauged the climate. Are they giving professional days this year or not? So the best I ever got was, I think once in a while I'd get my registration paid, but, absence with pay as opposed to losing my pay for the pay that I found.
I just want to ask one more question.
Yes.
What NCTE issues would you like to see addressed over the course of the year? Or addresses that you feel NCTE should address?
Well, yeah. Well, one is, I guess, that has come up is accessibility for maybe teacher presenters. So in other words, I don't think it's even the registration fees as much as some of the other expenses of coming to a conference. So I don't know how we can figure that out, but finding sources of funding that could maybe provide scholarships for people. The second is
I mean, at the national.
what?
I mean, at the national level.
Oh, on the national level.
Or state level.
Well, I do think that adage, what is tested is what is taught, is true. And I'm extremely worried about the standardized testing movement and how it's co-opted curriculum and instruction, where teachers are profoundly teaching to the test, and it has severely narrowed the curriculum. So the kind of inquiry projects that Debbie described and that I taught by are much less feasible now. And teachers are often held accountable based on the test scores, which is part of why they're called high stakes testing. And I think we know really comprehensive and excellent and very well documented ways of assessing children's development and learning towards rigorous achievement without the form it takes now. So that to me is a major primary concern.
Thank you both for your time and your service. We really appreciate you meeting with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.